So you can see over the screen.
I can see above the screen. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome to everybody. I've got quite a few new faces. First of all, I was asked to just say that registration is open. You just need to go to the website for Matan, press classes, and you can register for all or any of the 3 classes here on a Sunday. And if everyone just please turn down their phones so that they don't disturb during the shiur. Okay, Melissa Raymond is a lady who organizes Matan here in Beit Shemesh, but she's attending a simcha in America, so we're just standing in. Bracha and I are doing our best. And Rabbi Solomon.
It's all good. Okay, so I'm going to remove this. Thank you for being here in person and online. My name is Johnny Solomon, and thank you to Matan. Thank you to this wonderful center in honor and memory of Rabbi Twersky. Thank you to Bracha. Thank you to Melissa. Thank you, Leah. And we're hopefully going to be going on a journey, not just today, but for this coming year. And what I want to do right now is introduce this topic called controversial Teshuvot, briefly give a snapshot of what we hope to cover throughout the year, and then obviously get into the learning to the Teshuvot that we're going to cover. So what are Teshuvot? Well, Teshuvot, by the way, is a shortened version of the term Sheilot or Teshuvot, which in English often are translated as responsa. Sheilot are questions, Teshuvot are answers, and Sheilot or Teshuvot are really one of the largest areas of Jewish legal literature that exists, which for many of us, we haven't necessarily had a chance to encounter, explore, or examine. Sheilot or Teshuvot have been penned certainly since the time of the Geonim, which is the 9th century. In many ways, the questions asked even of Moshe Rabbeinu and the answers he gave, not Slofchad, is a form of Sheila and Teshuvah. And that means already since the biblical time, whenever a question arose, that until that point, that situation hadn't necessarily been encountered, when that question is asked and the answer is given, there you have Sheila or Teshuvah. And there are hundreds of thousands, millions, in fact, of Sheilot or Teshuvot individuals, certainly hundreds of thousands of volumes, of rabbis from all places around the world. And they're a rich source of precedent. We use them to determine what is the law, but also of history, of sociology. You've probably heard of names of some responsa writers. Just now over Shabbat, we commemorated the 8th Yortzeit of Rabbi Yosef, who wrote many responsa. Rav Moshe Feinstein, these are more modern responsa authors. But there are many others whose names perhaps we don't know, but whose importance in terms of the development of halakha certainly shouldn't be undermined. What we're going to be doing this semester is studying some of the most interesting, in my eyes, of Teshuvot. I call them controversial Teshuvot, although for some perhaps they're not so controversial. For some, they could be radical. We're going to be studying questions and answers posed of rabbis over the ages, which tell us about issues that arose and perhaps solutions that they found, which may well be surprising, whose implications may well be felt even until today. And what you have in front of you is, and I hopefully this was shared also online for those joining us online, is a brief course description and course timetable. As I write at the bottom a disclaimer, this timetable is a guide to the Teshuvot we intend to cover, but may well be subject to change. What you see here is a list of 28 sessions in which we cover pretty much chronologically a series of questions addressed by a range of different scholars around the world, which are of significance. Sometimes their answer is significant. Sometimes the very fact that this question was posed was itself significant. Sometimes they gave one answer and then changed their mind. Sometimes they gave an answer and somebody else strongly disagreed. But we'll be discussing issues to do with prophecy. We'll be discussing issues to do with identity, to do with basic halakha, how to relate to Shabbat desecrators, how to deal with blood and DNA evidence, conversion, AID, artificial insemination by donor, etc., etc. So all of these questions have been hot topics over the past perhaps 1,200 years. And every session will be a standalone session, and hopefully will give rise to conversations both when we're here and also beyond. And that's one of the reasons I put my email address at the top, not just of this, but also the handout. That means if you want to be in contact with me, either via WhatsApp or email or whatever, because there's something that either was interesting or you want to follow up, please feel free to do so. So before we go on, any particular questions, housekeeping questions about what's going on, both from here physically and those online? No? Okay. So let's begin with today's session, titled Rav Natranai Gaon and Rashi on apostates. And before we get to the nitty-gritty of the question, it's important to note that oftentimes the sponsor will open up a wide theological issue, but as a result of a narrow halachic question. So a specific question will be asked, but the implications of that have significant bearing on whatever's being discussed. And so you may well have a specific din to do with apostasy, and we're going to see now inheritance, but then that raises a big question of who is a Jew. At times you can have responses which are purely theological, and at times you can have responses which are purely technical. Each ultimately are a world unto themselves, which is why I love this literature so much. But before we get there, we need to define what is the term apostate. What is an apostate? We're saying of Natranai Gaon and Rashi will define and introduce those scholars. But what is an apostate? Well, an apostate is somebody who is converted out of or turned their back on Judaism. Sometimes that term, that we refer to that person as a mumar, mem vav mem reish, or sometimes, as we're going to see here in these Teshuvot, as a mushumad, with its root being shamad, to destroy something. Somebody who leaves the faith or convert to another faith is as if destroying the future of themselves and their children in terms of their relationship with the faith. Sometimes mushumad refers to somebody who was forced to convert but maintained that new faith, or somebody who chose to leave and adopted a different faith. So every mushumad in many ways is different. Their journey is different, and we'll know that based on their historical context. Nevertheless, somebody who formally makes a public declaration of leaving the faith, where there seems to be some measure of choosing, raises an interesting question. And the question which we're going to be addressing here in actually these three Teshuvot relates to their Jewish status. You'll know that in the years around and following the establishment of the State of Israel, a big question was asked in relation to the law of return. Who is a Jew? Well, as Gerald Blitzstein explains, the literature we're going to be studying today really asks a slightly different question. Who is not a Jew? If somebody's Jewish and they leave Judaism, does that diminish their Jewishness? That may well sound strange, of course. How can somebody lose their Jewishness? If you're born Jewish, then you are Jewish. We think we know that. But what we're going to be doing now is looking at some interesting Teshuvot and realize that that was a significant debate. A significant debate that began really about 1,200 years ago and on occasion has raised its head when other flashpoints have occurred in Jewish history. So the question we're going to pose is, if somebody leaves Judaism, do they remain Jewish? And yet that's not the question that's asked of the response authors. It's something much more specific. In general, people didn't ask these broad, general questions of Rabbanim. They asked specific halachic shilas. And so we now turn to source one. And before we read a bit of the Hebrew, I want you to look at footnote 1, just for the sake of giving some kind of biographical access. I've quoted the first few lines of Wikipedia, wherever I feel it's at least broadly accurate. And here we introduce Rav Natranai Gaon. Who is Rav Natranai Gaon? Well, Natranai ben Hillel was Gaon of the Surah Academy early in the second half of the 9th century. You'll probably know that the main place of Jewish residence between really the 700s and the 1000s was Babylon. At that point, yes, there were Jews moving into Europe, but the two main academies were in Babylon, known as Surah and Pumbedita. And it was there in Bavel where the period of the Gaonim was established. It was there in Bavel when the post-Talmudic scholars called the Gaonim did their work, helping people understand how to live as they ebbed away from just Babylon and Israel to places like North Africa and Europe. And whenever you go to a new place and you encounter new situations, new questions arise. I'll give you a very simple one. In the Teshuvot of the Gaonim, they are asked a question: how do I make charoset on Pesach when the ingredients I'm used to having in Israel are not available in my new country? That may seem like a small thing, but charoset is a ritual food. And if you haven't got what you're used to having, you ask a scholar, what do I do in terms of being loyal to the tradition, notwithstanding my changed circumstance? Responses are where people encounter a new problem, aren't sure what to do, and turn to their sages for advice. And so here we read a tshuva asked of Rav Natronai Gaon, and it says, Lo Rav Natronai, the first line you can see here, Ushe'altem shumad I yoresh et aviv Yisrael or lo. Rav Natronai Gaon is asked a fascinating question. Imagine you have Jewish children, Jewish parents, and a child of those Jewish parents becomes an apostate for whatever reason, which isn't necessarily clear from the answer. That person leaves the faith, they adopt another faith, or they walk away from the faith. They do something which publicly declares their lack of identification with Judaism, even though they certainly still have some measure of Jewish identity. And the question is asked, when the parent dies, does a child inherit the parent? Or specifically, if the father dies, does the son, in this particular case, inherit the father? Now, why should that make a difference? I mean, the belief of the child, why should that scupper their ability to inherit money of a deceased parent? Well, as Rav Natronai Gaon is going to proceed and explain, actually, family isn't just about biology. It's about identity. It's about seeing yourself as being part of a family unit. And part of a Jewish family unit includes a faith, a belief, Judaism. And as a result of that, somebody who says, I have no interest in Judaism, and they reject the faith of their ancestors. In many ways, they reject what they've received from their ancestors, according to Rav Natronai Gaon, brings into question whether they are worthy to be beneficiaries to receive the financial gifts and inheritance of a parent. By rejecting the faith, they sever ties with their faith family. And the question asked of Rav Natronai Gaon is, does that mean they sever their physical benefits from their faith family? Now, perhaps the way I presented this response and what it actually is seem to differ. I said we're going to discuss who is not a Jew, whereas the specific question is, does basically a child who rejects the faith of their parents inherit? Well, obviously, a parent could say, I don't want my child to inherit, I suppose. But as we're going to see, Rav Natronai Gaon, though looking at it initially as a purely legal question, sees this as a deeply theological one. For the reasons I've mentioned. The family has at its heartbeat faith. And to reject where you come from means to block what you get from them. Significantly, this very same scholar of Natronai Gaon does have a tempered view about apostates. What do I mean by that? Imagine, for example, a man marries a woman and then during his marriage, he becomes an apostate. The question asked of many Gaonim and later scholars is, does that marriage automatically sever? Does a rejection of one's faith dissolve the bond that's been created from that faith? It's an interesting question. If you're married, or either the man or the woman, and they become apostates, do they remain married? Now, Rav Nachman got on elsewhere rules that they remain married, and if he wishes to divorce, and that's what's considered to be grounds for divorce, he can write a writ of divorce, a get, and is considered to be a sufficient Jew to do so. But what he's asked here is something different. He may well be Jewish enough to give a get, but is he Jewish enough to receive something from his ancestors? Meaning Jewishness, and this is discussed by a range of more contemporary scholars, including Rabbi Lichtenstein in his famous essay about Brother Daniel, including interesting Teshuvah by Dayan Ezra Basri. When we talk about Jewishness, we often think about it as all or nothing. You're all either you are Jewish or you're not Jewish. The reality is, and this was discussed from this time until now, the question is Jewish for what? According to Rav Nachman I got on, an apostate is Jewish enough that their marriage has integrity and a man can write a get, but not Jewish enough that he can receive an inheritance of that. And why? And this is where he explains. In the opening lines, we're going to focus primarily on the first paragraph, although mention the second and third. It's grounds for divorce. Just to repeat for those who can't hear, can a wife demand a divorce if her husband becomes an apostate? Yes, it's grounds for divorce. But the question is the marriage automatically dissolved, or does a divorce need to be given? According to Rav Nachman I go on, they're still married. He's still Jewish enough to be married, and Jewish enough to give the get. But as we see here in a different aspect of Jewish law, namely inheritance, he's not Jewish enough to be the beneficiary of his father's inheritance.
He can be forced, right? Because he might say, I'm not going to give you.
Yeah, he can be forced. I mean, that's a whole wider question of forcing divorce, but yes, 100%. Any further thoughts just on what's been said? I think it's an important question there, and others that's been touched upon.
Yeah, I mean, as far as inheritance goes, it's a two-way thing as well. Like the parents make, the person who passed away has to make a choice. They have a halakhic law, like that's their choice. I mean, is it, and if somebody changes their status, does that doesn't necessarily change that one? It's a two-directional thing.
Well,
as far as inheritance goes.
So it's important to note that we have a view of inheritance, that our will directs the funds of inheritance. The fact is that Jewish law has a system which automatically directs the funds. So I would say you're right, all things being equal, were we not to be told something different, what is, shall we say, the view of the Torah of such a situation? Does the Torah view money as automatically then being transferred to the son in this case? And Rav Nachman I go on is going to say, I believe the Torah says that it's not appropriate. That somehow, as I say, by rejecting your ancestry, by rejecting where you came from, by rejecting how you were brought up, by rejecting ultimately the home from which you grew and the faith which your parents raised you to, it means you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't say, I'm not interested in that, but I'm interested in that. Relationships need to have integrity. That's what he's going to argue. We're going to see different. So, yeah.
But that negates the possibility of Teshuvah. It says it's a one-way street. Once you've got the faith, that's it, you'll never come back. That's not really the view that you take. There's always the chance that someone will do Teshuvah and come back.
Correct.
If you cut for someone, in your will, that's it. That's also a one-way street.
Well, firstly,
you're going to push them even further away, and lessen the chances that they'll come back.
firstly, this isn't what a parent writes. Here we're talking about what should automatically happen. The Nachman I go on is saying, if this happens, does a son inherit the father without any specific alternative instructions? Well, one second, and then we'll take this. But secondly, if the child does Teshuvah, then he's not a mushumat. We're only at this moment in time where the parent passes on, is a child considered to be a spiritual heir of the parent? And Rav Nachman I go on is going to say, no. That doesn't mean that they're not a biological child, they are. And that doesn't mean that child can't repair that fracture, which they can. But as things are right now, he's going to say there's something so deeply problematic about you rejecting your faith that undermines that bond, the avenue in which the inheritance is coming forth. That's going to be his view. We're going to see a different view from Rashi. Thoughts on?
I think I'm understanding it correctly. An apostate is someone who makes a definite, he says, I'm now leaving Judaism, I'm becoming something else. It's not just someone who leaves the faith, it's not someone who becomes not firm or assimilates or something.
Correct.
It's not like today with all the assimilation. It's not everybody who's married a non-Jew. It's just people who've really become.
Well, the question that's been asked, the last 100 or so years is what's the status of the secular Jew? Is it like an apostate? Is it like a confused Jew? And we're going to see a Teshuvah of Yaakov Ettlinger about Shabbat desecrators, which became a really important Teshuvah and has affected policy in every shul that we go to or have been to. However, in recent years, contemporary Rabbanim have suggested that perhaps a slight variation of his position should be adopted now that so much information is available, and if somebody really wants to join back Judaism, they could. Well, that's going to be our conversation for them. So you can see all of these, they're not just mere historical snapshots. This is a really important question. Is it possible that when somebody says they're leaving their faith says, you are less of a member of the faith from now on? And let's see the language of Natan. Let's just see a couple of lines and then we'll come back to the questions. Let's see the language, particularly this first paragraph. Curiously, by the way, I should say one further comment. Who are the Gaonim? They're living after the Talmudic period. That means the only literature they have is the Tanakh, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. They don't have Rashi. Rashi isn't yet born. They don't have Ramban or Rambam or Rashba and all the other people on the list. And so their method of halachic decision-making is exclusively based on scripture, right, and Mishnah and Gemara. They were the first responsa authors, and they had the least amount, shall we say, of ingredients from which they came up with some profound precedents. Nowadays, in responsa, you have not just Psukim and Mishnah and Gemara, but all the other lists, which is one of the reasons why the Gaonic response are much, much shorter, and those nowadays are often much, much longer. But let's see, what does he say? This is what I've been revealed from heaven. Now, he's not saying he's deciding the law through prophecy, but as if to say, from my reflection with divine assistance, this is what I think is the law. An apostate does not inherit his Jewish father. Ma taima, what is the reason? The kevan the ishtamedle nafikle mikdusha de Israel mikdusha da'avu. Which even if your Aramaic is a bit rusty, we'll figure it out. Since this person has apostatized, therefore they have lost an element of their sanctity of being part of the Jewish people and of the sanctity that stems from being the child of their father. That's pretty stark. Apostasy, he doesn't say completely severs your Jewish ties, you're still considered partially Jewish, but it has diluted your Kudushat Israel. And as a result of that, it has diluted your spiritual bond between parent and child, because faith comes through family. And he says, if you want me to show you how, and this becomes even more fascinating, he then quotes biblical precedent. He says, we find that a person only inherits when they are Jewish, in as much as of the faith of the parent, and they follow the ways of, in this case, the father. Dichtiv, as it says, and I gave to you and to your seed after you. What is this referring to? This is referring to Yitzchak and Ishmael. Who inherits Abraham? He has two sons, right? But who inherits Abraham? Well, we are told in the Torah the following. We are told that God will give to Abraham and to offspring after him. And we are told that Abraham's offspring will inherit the land of Israel. And we are told then, and let's skip a line, Yitzchak is going to be called your seed. Now, Ishmael is Avram's son. That there is no dispute about. But in terms of being a spiritual heir, in terms of actually receiving what comes from his parent, only Yitzchak is determined as being the physical, because only Yitzchak continued in the ways of his father. For Anat and I go on, the biblical story of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Ishmael. And he goes on, by the way, to then examine stories of Yaakov and Esav as well. He says, by following in the footsteps of the parents, you then become a beneficiary of what they leave. By failing to follow in the footsteps of the parents, by severing ties, by saying, I have nothing to do with you, then you're right. You have nothing to get from them. It may sound harsh today, but from that when I go on, what you are stems from what you identify with. If you cease to identify with your parents as being true spiritual ancestors, role models, then that will have a physical impact on what you receive. So I'll pause here for a second, though there's more to study. But when you think about this tshuva, it is quite simply radical. Yeah? It tells us that there is two types of Judaism, or at least there is Judaism for different things. For marriage, which even according to this scholar of natural I go on, an apostate can still divorce within that marriage. But he also says that there's a certain measure of Judaism that you can lose when you become an apostate. There's a difference between Jewish identity and Jewish identification. Perhaps you can't lose your Jewish identity in as much as you're still the biological child of this one and that one. But by ceasing to identify as a Jew, well, that's going to have an impact on some things. He that says these things, other scholars, other Gaonim also discuss this topic, and some agree with him, some take a slightly sharper view. Nevertheless, the way he explains this is one of the reasons I presented this tshuva. So this becomes an important topic from then and on. Sorry, yes.
I was going to say, in Torah, you have, if somebody starts worshiping idols and a city is not following God's ways, it's supposed to destroy them, even if they're your own brother or wife. So if somebody does that, they are no longer, they're dead. You don't have to go out and kill them, but they can't inherit if they're dead. So it's like people said Shiva for people who went off the derech and who identified as non-Jews and so on. And in the Torah, it's violent, but you're supposed to kill your own wife if she starts being an idol worship. It specifically says that the wife of your bosom, your brother. And when the people are worshiping the idol, the golden calf, Moses says you have to kill your brother. Who is ready to kill his brother? I mean, it's like saying people who go away from identifying as Jews, they are gone.
Well, that's going to be the question. And it's important to note that though the Torah does have a harsh view on idolatry, when we clarify what we mean by the Torah, we mean God. God says, these are my rules, and these are the punishments that are going to come from those who break these rules. It was only until this point, only about 1,200 years ago, give or take, where we had this significant phenomenon. I know, of course, at the rise of Christianity, we had it, but that was a process, not a moment. And how to look at that period in history is a little bit tricky, but only here, when you already have the establishment of Christianity as a distinct faith, and Islam, of course, as well, that these questions arise. And what Rav Nachman Gaon is being asked, to use a modern term, is what's a das Torah? What's a Torah view of something that we haven't yet identified. And he says this, Jewish enough for X, but not Jewish enough for Y. So
No, for me, it seems to be a huge sociological thing here. Where I've got on, it's sort of sees the parental relationship very different to how we see it in our day. Like, on the fact that the marriage is different to inheritance, the pure role of how he sees parents is parents' religion, and there's no division there. Nowadays, we don't see it that way, and it evolved differently for obvious reasons. But when your parents are the link in the chain, once you've broken that link in the chain, it's not to do with the relationship. Do I still get on? Do I still have respect for my parents? It's not relevant to him because their pure purpose is a chain, basically.
Right.
And that's what makes it very clear to him that he doesn't see it as anything else.
correct. Which is why these Teshuvot are fascinating. The point is, you can agree with Nathan go on or staunchly disagree. But what's fascinating is the picture he's painting in terms of the child-parent dynamic. What is family? What is faith? What are the implications of rejecting faith? It's not just a personal thing. Nowadays we say it's a personal thing. He says, what are you talking about? Judaism isn't a personal thing. It's all about what you got. It's all about where you came from. It's all about your family, and it's all about your future. You can make that choice, and Kadosh Baruch Hu will make his decision about what should come to you. But don't think it doesn't impact the social network. And we, as rabbinic decisors, concern ourselves not just with the private, but also with the things that affect the community, the society. And so apostasy became a massive conversation from that point onwards. Sorry.
I know a case personally where the son walked away from Judaism. He got married in a Catholic church, a Catholic girl, took nothing at all to do with Judaism. He didn't live in the town. He kept telephone communication with his parents. His father passed away. He came to the Lavoya and he left. That was it. He didn't sit Shabbat for his God, nothing. When the mother passed away, he had two sisters. The two sisters were married to Jewish men who felt that it was not the sons-in-law's place to say Kaddish for the mother. She was a very devout woman, an old woman, right? My husband used to change her dishes for her and everything, even in their 80s when it came to Pesach. He used to do a changeover for her. You know what? That son, still married to the Catholic girl, but came to shul, right? He sat shiva for his mother. He hadn't sat for his father, right? The sisters pleaded with him to say Kaddish at least to the end of the Shalashim for the mother, right? Which he did. The son has slowly come back into Judaism. If he'd been cut off by inheritance in that way, that might have just completely done it for him.
So I think that's a powerful story. Right. I think it's a powerful story. At the same time, I also think the questions of if things were to be different, how would they have played out is one which is impossible to answer. And one could argue the following. Right now, the statistics of intermarriage are very frightening. And perhaps if we had taken a more firm position over the past few decades, things would be different too. I'm not a prophet, none of us are, but what we do know is as this process began around about this period of history, the rabbis were grappling to come up with solutions, and according to Rabbi Nathan, looking at the Torah, looking at the story of Yitzchak and Ishmael, he felt that this was the right response in terms of Jewish inheritance. Again, to say what would have been different, I think it's hard to know.
This man has got grown-up daughters and children who were married in a Catholic church, whose family didn't go to the wedding, nothing. But he's our age, and he has come back into Judaism. And
that should be praised. But again,
but the law of inheritance could have actually been the final straw. They would say, I would just completely cut out because of this. I really do want nothing more to do with it.
Possibly so, but remember, we're thinking now 1,200 years ago. The world is different now, right? The options are different now. The policies are different now, and that's going to be part of our discussion when we get to Rav Etling, etc. Still, though, there are always going to be interesting cases which seem to prove one way or another. Here we're setting precedent. We're setting policy for them and those needs at that time, which perhaps are very different to our needs and our time.
So the question here is, what does he mean by a mar or mushmar, as he called it? What exactly is the definition of that? That's what I think the question is here.
Okay, so again, even though much work has been done in terms of understanding the term shumad, which is it's generally considered to be joining another faith either out of force or choice or rejecting one's faith. Every case is different, and unless you have like a biography of that particular person, right, you don't necessarily know. You can see that there's not much said about this particular person. What's the point of the responser? Rav Nachman I go on isn't thinking about telling a biography of the questioner who may or may not know. He was probably asked this question from another rabbi. He may not know the individual. It's a policy, right? He is setting policy. He says, in a case like this, and he knows what Meshuvah meant in Surah 1,200 years ago, which may well have meant things different in later generations. He says, this is what I think the policy is. That's the way, that's how we need to look at the Teshuvah based on when it's written, right? And the language of the time, although the word Meshumad has layers of meaning from then till now. And so it's hard for us to necessarily know what was being thought of at the moment. I do, though, want to press on to the next Teshuvah. Yes, sir.
Just one quick note. When the person who inherits Abraham is Yitzchak, God tells him that it will be Sarah's child who inherits. Before he does anything, or even follows in his ways, he knows that it's only Sarah's child. And I argue that we are not sons of Abraham, we're descendants of Sarah.
I understand. Again, he's making, in his mind, a legal point. He then quotes a Gemara in Kiddushin saying, how about a situation where we seem to be told that somebody who is not Jewish, can they inherit the parent? And it seems to be that they can. And then he says it's all about identification. There's obviously much work that needs to be done in deconstructing the argumentation of Nachman Egon's Teshuvah. The truth is, sometimes we'll do that only because I want to look at two others, only because of time, we're going to hold that back. But I do have a translation of part of this Teshuvah, which I'm happy to send. I also have a slightly more an academic print of this Teshuvah with some further footnotes that may be of interest, which again, I'm happy to send. It's a kind of text where one needs to spend quite a bit of time looking through, considering the steps from which he's thinking, but also asking the following question. Are the sources he's citing really where he's drawing his rule and precedent? Or basically, is this a policy and he's kind of almost pinning these sources after the fact to what? So, and sometimes it's going to be one and sometimes it's going to be the other. Meaning, is he saying, I have no idea, and I read this posuk and everything was clear to me? Or you say, I have an idea, and by the way, here's some psukim to satisfy you in terms of the approach in which I'm adopting. So the evidence that a posek brings to support their conjecture sometimes can be absent of that, they didn't have a clue, or even absent of that, they had a very strong idea, but they wanted to give the questioner a sense of the kind of ballpark of areas of sources which may have inspired them to reach their conclusion. So every posek works differently. Imagine, I mean, I have lots of volumes of response at home. Every response author relates to Tanakh and Mishnah and Gemara and Rishonim and Acharonim differently. They read the sources differently, they draw their conclusions differently, they have different worldviews. And that's why we often have a machlokah between this rabbi and that rabbi. It's rarely because they felt like arguing. It's because one rabbi has a strong view of natural law and one person doesn't. One rabbi believes that Shabbat must be protected at all costs. Another person says yes, but most, but not necessarily all. And getting a sense of their worldview is essential in understanding their derech psika, their halachic policy making. From Nachman Egon, we've read a few lines. Obviously, there's work to be done, a fascinating project though. And he wrote almost more responsa than anybody in the Gaonic period. So we do have quite a bit of content to study and then get a feeling of how he passes. But nowadays, as I say, when our bookshelves are so much more weighted with Rishonim and Acharonim, it's hard to think about how they thought when they had just Tanakh, Mishnah, and Gemara. But with that in mind, I want us to turn the page to two Teshuvot of Rashi. Now, I want to point out something which most of us rarely think about. We think of Rashi as a commentator, of which Rashi is the greatest, on Chumash and Mishnah and Gemara. Rashi was also a posek. We have a volume of the Teshuvot, of the response of Rashi. Questions he was asked and the answers he gave. And when you think about that, actually, if you really want to know who is Rashi, you'll probably feel it more through his Teshuvot than his commentary. In fact, I think that in general, Teshuvot are a wonderful window in getting to know, shall we say, the personality of the posek. And that's one of the reasons it drives me to study this literature. Rashi lives a little bit after Rav Nachman Gaon in a different place. He's not in Babylon, he's famously in France. Not 9th century, but now 11th century. But just as conversions, forced and otherwise, to Islam and Christianity had developed already by the 9th century, certainly this was the case by the 11th. If you're living in France, you've got crusades. Rashi lives through that, and he describes it in many ways, sometimes more explicit, sometimes more veiled. But if you look through his commentary, even on the Torah, you find certain allusions to how we relate to others, and especially how you relate to those who wish to do you harm. But Rashi was asked a question relating to apostasy. In fact, he was asked two questions. We have them here, sources 2 and 3. And I want us to read a few excerpts from them because Rashi's responses here are perhaps even more groundbreaking than Rav Nachman Gaon. Maybe for the modern sensibility, Rav Nachman Gaon's answer seems really harsh, rejecting, cold. But, you know, Judaism has often had boundaries. And what he's saying is, within the sphere of inheritance, I feel that an apostate has crossed that line, even though, as mentioned, elsewhere he rules that an apostate can still give a get, that their marriage still has integrity, that you don't completely sever your Jewish ties, one can distinguish between identity and identification. What does Rashi say? Well, Rashi, his Teshuvot are remarkable because, you know, I mentioned before that sometimes you can take texts and stretch them almost to fit, I wouldn't say your agenda, because that sounds like every posek has a very, very specific agenda, which some certainly do, but I wouldn't want to attribute that to all. But sometimes you can take texts which mean a narrow thing and broaden them because you feel they very powerfully capture a sentiment that relates to the question you're answering. Well, Rashi does this. He does this here in the next Teshuvah, which confuses some, inspires me. What does Rashi do? He goes out to bat for the totality of the Jewish people. And he says, and I'll say it in my own words and then we'll study it. He says, even the most mistaken, erroneous, bad Jew is always fully Jewish. Now, let's compare that Rav Nachman Gaon. I want to quote to you from Joel Blitzstein. He says, Rav Nachman Gaon is saying in effect that an apostate is a bad Jew and only good Jews, those who accept the spiritual inheritance, inherit their father's estate. What does Rashi say? He says, you can be a bad Jew, but that doesn't diminish in any way your Jewish identity. You are not a diluted Jew. You are a fully fledged Jew always. Now, this is quite significant. Of course, one could perhaps say that maybe Rav Nachman Gaon speaking about people who willingly converted and Rashi talking about those who didn't. That may be partially true. But the message of Rashi is that whatever happens, whether by chance or by fault, a Jew adopts or is pushed into adopting a different faith, they don't lose even 1% of their Jewish status. And let's see where he draws this from and the case that he is particularly discussing. So he specifically discusses in source number 2, Sheilot Teshuvot Rashi, Simon Kuf Ayin Aleph. He discusses a young man and woman who are betrothed, right? They are engaged to be married, and they are forced to then become apostates. And the question is, does their marriage have the integrity that we spoke about, do you remember, with Rabbi Natron? Are two Jews who are then forced to leave the faith, are they still considered Jewish in terms of their marriage, which occurred through the framework of Jewish law? And Rashi says something really quite remarkable. If you look on the third line, it says, he says, not only in this case where they were forced, he says, even somebody who willingly becomes an apostate, even somebody who willingly joins another faith, their marriage is a marriage. He's quoting there from Gemara Yevamot, but stretching it more than the Gemara itself seems to be discussed. And then he does the ultimate stretch, which has been the subject of papers by Yaakov Katz. Let me give you a little bit of background of the line we're going to read. You may know the story of Achan in early on in Sefer Yoshua. Achan stole from the boot of Jericho, from which we learn that when one person sins, in many ways the whole people sins because the people should have stopped that one person. And yet Achan is referred to, even when sinning, as being Yisrael, Chata Yisrael, right? Israel has sinned. When they say it wasn't just Israel, it was just an individual. And they say, yeah, well, he sinned, but really it was a fault of many others. But what the Gemara in Sanhedrin points out is, even though Achan does this bad sin at the time, it has significant, impact on how the Jews should see themselves in the early years of their entry into the land of Israel. He's still identified as being Israel. And here we hear the following phrase, Yisrael af al pi shechata Yisrael. A Jew, even if they have sinned, is a Jew. Now, in general, most commentators understand that Gemara to mean a Jew who does something bad, like stealing, they're still Jewish. Okay, that's nice to know. But what Rashi does is say, a Jew who apostatizes, even out of choice, who leaves the faith completely, who doesn't identify with Judaism, he says, even that person, Yisrael afa pi shechata Yisrael, which is a poetic take on, it's a legal take on perhaps a poetic saying. Most people who read that Gemara in Sanhedrin didn't believe that applied to somebody who leaves Judaism, but Rashi says it does. And he staunchly says it, not just here, but then in the next Teshuvah discussing interest. What do we mean by interest? The Torah forbids us charging interest to Jews. A different rule applies to non-Jews. It's a law related to whether that person is your brother, achicha, right? Whether a brother comes to you, you shall not charge him interest, etc. And according to some Rishonim, including the Mordechai, a person who apostatized, even if they don't fully lose their Jewish status, they're not considered to be brother because they're not part of the family, a bit like Rav Natron, right? Rashi says, what are you talking about? Yisrael afa pi shechata Yisrael. A Jew is a Jew is a Jew, no matter what they do, even if they reject everything, they are Jewish. I want us to reflect on these different positions of the Natron I mentioned also the Mordechai. There are other Rishonim who take that view, and that of Rashi. There are some who say that a Jew who rejects their faith loses part of that faith identity because they threw it away. Meaning, I wouldn't even say they lose it. They themselves have erased it on their Tudat Zut, right? They themselves have taken whatever, white, and they've gotten rid of the name Yisrael. I'm hardly doing anything to them. They've done it to themselves. That's kind of a natural position. Somebody who doesn't continue the ways of the parents of themselves kind of disassociated themselves from the faith family from which they've come. And family is faith. Rashi says, no. Yes, faith and family come together. I get that. He's not foolish. He says, but Jewishness isn't something you can get rid of. Whether you identify as Jewish or not, you're always Jewish, 100%. No matter how hard you try, you want to convert to another faith, you're still Jewish. Rashi takes a view that our Jewish status has no direct relationship to our Jewish behavior, not in the slightest. And he broadens this statement of Yisrael Afapish Chata Yisraeli, which again, almost all the other commentaries do not view it the way he does, and takes this nice poetic statement and says, this is a psak, this is a halacha. That is to say, two Jews who become apostates, they're still Jewish, they're still married, if they want a divorce, that's fine, whatever. But the point is, their identity has integrity. And he says, a Jew is apostasite, of course you can't charge him interest. See the second tshuva. Asuli kach ribit Yisrael mushumad da'achicha karinan bey. It is forbidden to charge interest from an apostate Jew because a Jew is called your brother. And what is an apostate? An apostate is a Jewish apostate who's done things wrong. Still your brother, still your family, still part of the Jewish people. We've all learned Rashi in one way or another in his commentary on Chumash, Mishnah, and Gemara. But just think what he's saying. And I can tell you that he is not the consensus, and yet his position pretty much won. He became this advocate, this ambassador for Jews going through rough times, sometimes of their making, sometimes not. Remember, the case originally was a couple who were forced to convert. He says it applies also to somebody who chooses. He says, almost on my watch, nobody ever gets to say that any Jew is anything other than 100% Jewish. And it's a beautiful idea. It's groundbreaking. Because although we didn't plumb into the depths of the sources cited by Rav Nachman Gaon, arguably his sources are better than Rashi's. What does Rashi mean? Brother, you're going to call someone who rejects their faith still your brother? He says, I think so. You're going to call someone who rejects being part of Israel? He says, I think so. He doesn't just say it once, he says it twice. He says, not one drop of Judaism is lost by such a person. And when you think about the relationship between psak and policy, and that's an area of great interest in mine, you see, halachic rulings often set policy or affect policy. Right? Would you agree that? There is a direct correlation between an individual ruling, sometimes about an individual, and how it plays out into the street. We could kind of do a thought experiment. If we took the view of Nachman Gaon, who it's still a nuanced view, says they're Jewish enough to remain married or divorced, but they lose part. They're not your brother. Would say there are these two tiers of Jews. There's the partial Yisrael and the fully fledged Yisrael. You should know this is an idea which has been toyed about ever since. There are writings on this topic from then till now. I have an abundance of them because I helped somebody to do a study on this particular topic. And Rashi says there is no such thing. You cannot divide Jewishness. You cannot take a bit away. It's a person, no matter wherever, whatever they do. They can be a sinful Jew, a lousy Jew. They can be an apostate Jew. But that word Jew doesn't budge from their identity status. Sorry.
I like Rashi's answer, but I feel like he just said it because this is what he believed. And the first two got an explanation of where it comes from. But here, okay, it's great, but Rashi must have had a reason that he said it. And I mean, it's just my heart.
Well, I mentioned before that sometimes a posek has a hunch and then find sources that support their hunch. Sometimes they have no hunch and they just look at sources and the answer comes from there. And I have to tell you, as somebody, I'm no great passer, my Rav was, and I sometimes do reach halachic decisions. You never quite know. Sometimes a question arises and you say, I don't know where to go, and I'm just going to dive into Torah and come out with the answer. And sometimes you say, I know. I don't know where I know it from, but I just know. And now, I actually give a course called Subjectivity and Halachic Decision Making, where you draw the line, right? And that's a really hard thing to consider. Is it just that person's opinion, or does it come from somewhere much deeper? And although I could speak about that for hours, and I do, and there are examples one way or another, it's almost unsolvable because it's very difficult to necessarily know where ideas come from and how they are shaped. What I would say is, even though we are only having a brief snapshot of these Teshuvot, and obviously everyone needs to be studied from beginning to end, there seems to be more of a gut in Rashi's answer that Rav Nachman and I go on to, even though I think there's also that in his. And in terms of the critique given to Rashi's answer, people generally don't point fingers at Rashi and say, what do you know, right? But when it came down to these Teshuvot, they said, what are you talking about? You're going to quote that in terms of setting policy? A statement about an individual Jew who sinned about a particular thing and then says a Jew rejects everything is still Jewish? That's like way over applying a text. And I mean, we don't necessarily get a feedback from Rashi. I think he says, like shoot, like what? Wait a minute. Because when a posek makes decisions, it's not just for the now, it's also for the future. It's not just that psak, it's also policy. When is Rashi living? He's living during the crusade. He has a question to ask. Are we going to have different types of Jews? Are you tier 1, tier 2, right? Do you have chisun 1 of, or do we not do that? You're living in turmoil. And he makes the call for reasons which are hinted to in these Teshuvot, but are certainly not fully answered here. That conversation isn't going to be happening. That Jews are going to be Jews, some who have been forced to convert, some who have chosen to convert. But I never want to hear that question being asked again, almost, right? He kind of almost shuts down the conversation because he has a certain perspective, a halachic perspective, which looks beyond and says, this answer is needed for now and for the future. Even though, again, when you actually look through the sources, you can't deny there are really good arguments offered by, I wouldn't say the other side, but the alternative approach, which kind of does draw some distinctions, at the very least with rebit, right? Or does, for example, you're supposed to return the lost property of your brother. So the Mordechai says, well, if that person's an apostate, you don't need to, they're gone, right? I mean, it's a nice thing to do. You're not obliged to. Rashi would say that's ridiculous. They're Jewish, you do it. So, quick thoughts.
Two thoughts I have that speak to me for what Rashi's position is. This one is like Rashi is putting Hashem, believing Hashem on a different plane to people's behavior. It's like, it doesn't matter what you do. Hashem is not, it's like, you're not parallel. Not like, okay, I'm going to reject this, you reject it. For me, I'm just feeling with Rashi, like, this is bigger than people's decisions. This is, for me, this is just how I feel what Rashi's saying.
Right.
Hashem is bigger, but Emunah is bigger than you ever could understand. And for me, that makes it very clear why Rashi would say what he said. And also, I feel that, like, the ramifications, I mean, this obviously the courses that you give, and I think that, like, I just feel like certain things don't work depending on the times we're living in. Just like parenting has changed from one generation to another, and what worked, I remember Rabbi Twirsky, so followed Rabbi said, telling a story, and he said, my grandmother told me, don't give a smack because it doesn't do anything nowadays. Like, right. In those days it worked. It's the same with everything. Things just don't work anymore. Like, you know, you're beautiful story, which is very, very inspiring. You know, sometimes it takes a real godol to be able to look up everything and to use their shkachaprati and to be able to say, this is how we have to view it nowadays. It's not in black and white, and that's why.
Right, but I mean, we see Rashi as this great godel, but know that his contemporaries and those who followed him, who were significant great scholars, some of them did not agree. This became a major dispute, not because we're deliberately trying to create these fault lines in Judaism, but you know, I'll tell you a beautiful idea related to last week's parasha, not last now 8 days ago, which is going to be useful for all of our conversations. It's an idea found in an early paper delivered by Chief Rabbi Sachs, whose first Yorta is coming up. And he says the following: the first word in the Torah is Bereshit, okay? And the word Reshit is understood to mean one of two things, according to Chazal, as recorded by Rashi. Reshit, according to some commentaries, refers to Torah. It's a code word for Torah. And Reshit, according to other commentaries, refers to Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. It's a code word we use in other different psukim. And the way Rabbi Sachs frames this is the ultimate halachic question is who wins when you have a contest almost between the Jewish people and Torah. And let me explain to you what this means, because once I first saw this, I thought, wow, what a profound way of understanding almost every meaningful halachic conversation. Here you have an apostate who's rejected Torah. In many ways, if I stand up for Torah, I should be making clear that that person has done harm, and I should be putting some kind of either penalties or at least communicating pretty harsh sentiments in defense of Torah. At the same time, though, we have the question of Am Yisrael, the Jewish people. And the Jewish people are broad and varied, and even more so now than ever before. And there are Jews who sometimes do things wrong, sometimes really bad things wrong. But if you're interested in the totality of the Jewish people, sometimes you have to turn a blind eye to certain Torah infractions in order to maintain that cohesive Jewish peoplehood unit. And the question found in almost every serious Teshuvah, which has an impact not just on psak and policy, most of which we're going to be studying this course is, which wins? And it's not a simple answer. Because as I was explaining to some of my students recently, somebody has to stand up for Torah too. I have to stand up for Shabbos. If somebody breaks Shabbos, I should be sympathetic, but I also need to stand up for Shabbos. But I also, at the same time, need to make it clear that that person does still belong to the Jewish people. And how to have it, as the Gemara says, with one hand pushing away and one hand drawing in. One hand making it clear you are out of line, but the other hand saying, I love you still. How to get both the Reshit of Torah and the Reshit of Am Yisrael. That's the tricky thing. Each of Nachman, Gaon, and Rashi are trying to come up with the right policy, each with incredible integrity. And it's hard to know what necessarily is right. I know what sounds more beautiful, of course. But in every new question, how we balance the Reshit of Torah and the Reshit of Israel is the ultimate halachic question that we face. Quick thoughts, and then we're going to be wrapping up.
Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews, tortured them.
Mm-hmm.
Ferdinand was Jewish. Ferdinand Isabella,
Yeah.
He was Jewish. So what limit do we say? Does that person still Jewish? Would you say, I mean, when they corrupt their souls to such a point? Also, Esau, he's a 20.
That's what Rav Nachman Gaon brings. And Rashi would say, yes, you're a terrible, terrible, terrible Jew. That's what he'd say.
But he's supposed to be killed at the end of it.
Unfortunately, we all die. Death doesn't make me less Jewish. He's supposed to be killed, I think, is an important expression of moral objection, but it doesn't necessarily say much about whether I see that person now as being less Jewish. Rashi is making a very clear point. Achan, about whom the story that he quotes involves. Achan, who was killed. It's a Jew.
He did a terrible thing.
Right, he's a Jew.
Rav Johnny,
That, according to Pshat of the Gemara, he's a Jew. He stretches it to say a person, it's not just who is a Jew, who does things wrong. It's somebody who rejects that whole faith. Yeah.
Rav Johnny,
Right.
Rashi's defense.
It's well. Now, where are we and where are we going? We've got 2 minutes left. So let's just briefly summarize and look ahead. So what we've done today is look at actually through controversial Teshuvot, or maybe whichever one you disagree with is a controversial one, whatever. But the point is, we've looked at a fascinating window in time in fascinating Teshuvot penned by great scholars, taking us back 1,200 years, 1,000 years. The questions being asked, the solutions being penned. These are fresh solutions, like freshly baked bread. It's wonderful when you see a question being asked for the first time and you're seeing the responder kind of giving a try at trying to solve it. Some may well have other iterations, but they don't have precedent to make their decisions. They are setting precedents. And almost all of these Teshuvot that we're going to cover are going to be doing exactly that. What I hope you got from this class not only is a window into why Sheilot Teshuvot are so fascinating, they're remarkable, right? They're profound, but also why we should learn them in teaching us how to reach halakhic decision makings, in considering what are the ingredients that go into halakhic decision making, what are the historical factors, what are the tensions inherent when big questions such as these arise. That's why I think courses such as these are so important. What we're going to be doing in the ensuing weeks is looking at different Teshuvot, some again relating to synagogues, some relating to Jewish identity, some relating to practices, each a different posek, each at a different time, each with different crises or challenges, each trying to find the right balance often between the Reshit of Torah and the Reshit Israel, and many of which have affected the way we think about Jewish law even till today. So with that in mind, I'm going to conclude. Thank you for those who are online. To respond to a question, I think we rather use videos and just share the handout, but if you have any questions, and I believe you received the handout from me, please write to me on my email or my WhatsApp number, and I wish you all well. And thank you again, Bracha and Melissa.
Rav Johnny, do you hear me?
Okay,
Rav Johnny, do you hear me?
well, I'm going to stop.
He's FHS if you hear him. Yes. Someone has.
Rav Johnny?
I can't actually.
Oh, you know why? The speakers are facing that way.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Hi, it's Miriam Weed. How are you?
It's a little hard for me to hear. Let me just. I'm going to go ahead and I'll try and listen. If not, please write.
Okay, I was going to say that this shir that you gave is very, very relevant for right now if you've been following what's going on with Rav Melamed and others. And
Yeah,
do you hear me?
Acutely, Rav Melamed and others.
Right.
Yeah.
And the problem comes in when it's bad enough when you're arguing vehemently different aspects of Torah, but when personality and power get involved, that's a recipe for pure disaster.
100%. I mean, I think it's for another time to me to offer my perspective about him, or that I think I've alluded to it also in the podcast I do with Ruby Sport and Mari Brovsky. But yes, unfortunately, when Jewish law is weaponized and power becomes the measure of success, then good people can be categorized as being bad people, and that's a tragedy. But yeah, this whole question is a constantly evolving and applicable issue. That's why it's so important to know this literature and to know it's not the first time we encountered it. Okay, I think we're going to end the recording now. Thank you all for joining, and of course, questions feel free to send.